The stagecoach rolled into Dry Creek, Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1884, and when the door creaked open, the woman who stepped down into the dust wore a dress so torn and travel-worn that the whole town seemed to hold its breath, for no one expected the mail-order bride they had waited 3 weeks for to arrive looking like a beggar woman fleeing the end of the earth, and no one, least of all Thomas Grady, standing stiff and silent by his wagon, could have guessed that this ragged stranger would become the answer to a prayer his 6-year-old daughter had been whispering into the prairie wind every night since her mother died. If you believe in kindness, in faith, in redemption, and in the quiet miracles that second chances bring, I ask you now, before this story carries you further down the dusty road it must travel, like, comment, share, and subscribe, for stories like this deserve to be remembered and passed on. Her name was Ruth Ann Calloway, and she had boarded that stagecoach in Kansas with nothing but a carpet bag, a Bible with a broken spine, and a letter folded so many times the creases had worn thin as lace. The letter had come from a rancher in Montana Territory who described himself plainly, a widower of 34 years, a man of modest means but honest character, seeking a wife who might also be a mother to his young daughter. Ruth had answered that advertisement not out of romance but out of desperation, for the boarding house in Abilene where she had worked scrubbing floors for 2 years had burned to the ground that spring, taking with it the last of her savings and the only roof she had left to call her own. She had buried her parents to the fever when she was 19, watched her younger brother ride off to the gold fields of Colorado and never ride again, and learned, in the hard years since, that a woman alone on the frontier was either married, working herself to the bone, or starving. So when the letter came promising a home, however humble, she had packed what little remained to her name and prayed the whole journey west that this rancher, this stranger, would not be cruel. The stagecoach had been robbed outside of Cheyenne. 2 masked riders who took the strongbox and cruelly rummaged through the passengers' belongings besides, tearing Ruth's second dress clean from her bag and leaving her with only the traveling dress on her back, which by the time she reached Dry Creek was patched with dust, torn at the hem from where she'd caught it climbing back into the coach, and stained with 3 weeks of hard travel. Her hair had come loose from its pins somewhere around the Wyoming line, and her hands, though small, bore the calluses of a woman who had never once in her life been given anything without earning it first. When she stepped down from that coach into the harsh Montana sunlight, she did not look like anyone's idea of a bride. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had survived, and who was terrified that surviving would not be enough. Thomas Grady had ridden into town that morning with his daughter Sarah, perched in front of him on the saddle, her small hands gripping the horse's mane, her eyes bright with a hope she had not shown since her mother's passing 2 winters before. Thomas himself was a broad-shouldered man with sun-weathered skin and a beard he had not properly trimmed since Martha died, and though his ranch was modest, 300 head of cattle, a 2-room house, and land that stretched toward the foothills of the Rockies, he had written that letter in a moment of quiet desperation, watching his daughter grow thinner and quieter with each passing month, needing something he could not give her alone. He had told himself he was looking for a wife to help run the household, to cook and mend and manage what a rancher's life demanded. He had not told himself, though he knew it in the marrow of his bones, that he was looking for someone to make his daughter smile again. When Ruth stepped down from that coach, a murmur passed through the small gathering of townsfolk who had come, as they always did, to see the mail-order bride arrive. Someone, the blacksmith's wife, sharp-tongued and unkind, laughed behind her hand and said loud enough to carry that Thomas Grady had ordered himself a scarecrow instead of a wife. Ruth's face burned scarlet, and she looked down at her ruined dress, at her dust-caked boots, and for one terrible moment she considered climbing straight back into that coach and riding on to nowhere at all, for nowhere seemed kinder than this. But then she felt a small hand slip into hers. Sarah Grady, 6 years old, with her mother's same chestnut hair and a gap where she had lost her front tooth that summer, had slipped down from her father's saddle and crossed the dusty street before Thomas could stop her, and she took Ruth's rough, trembling hand in her own small one and looked up with an expression so open and so full of longing that it stopped every whisper in the street dead. The child studied the ragged dress, the tired eyes, the hair come loose from its pins, and she did not see rags at all. She saw a woman who had traveled a long, hard way to reach them, and in her child's heart, that meant only one thing, that Ruth wanted to be there badly enough to endure it. And so, in a voice so soft that only Ruth and her father truly heard it, Sarah whispered, "Please be our mama," and something in Ruth Calloway's chest, some doors she had bolted shut years ago against hope and disappointment both, cracked open wide. Thomas crossed the street then, hat in hand, and though his instinct as a proud man might once have been to feel shame at the state of the bride he had summoned, one look at his daughter's face and the fierce, protective way she held onto this stranger's hand told him everything he needed to know about what mattered and what did not. He introduced himself plainly, apologized for the trouble of her journey, and though his voice was rough with the discomfort of a man and used to tenderness, there was no cruelty in it, no judgment of her torn dress or her travel-worn face. He simply asked if she was hungry, and if she would like to see her new home, and Ruth, who had braced herself for rejection or worse, found herself blinking back tears she refused to let fall in front of the gossiping townsfolk. The ride out to the Grady Ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and Ruth spent much of it in a silence that was not unhappy but simply overwhelmed, watching the vast Montana prairie roll past beneath a sky bigger than any she had ever known, the distant mountains capped already with the season's first snow, the grass gone gold and restless in the wind. Sarah rode nestled against her father in the wagon seat but kept twisting around to look at Ruth, as though afraid that if she looked away too long, this fragile new hope might vanish like morning mist. When they reached the ranch house, small and plain but sturdy, built with Thomas's own hands after a prairie fire had taken the first one years before, Ruth stood in the yard and felt something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. She felt that she had arrived somewhere, rather than merely stopped. The first weeks were not easy. Ruth was a stranger in a strange house, sleeping in a small room off the kitchen while she and Thomas observed the careful courtesies of two people who had agreed to build a marriage before they had built any affection between them. She rose before dawn to milk the cow and start the fire, worked her hands raw scrubbing floors that had gone neglected since Martha's death, and mended clothes late into the night by lamplight, determined that no one would ever again call her a burden or a disappointment. Thomas, for his part, was a quiet man, careful with his words, and it took him time to unlearn the guardedness that grief had taught him. But it was Sarah who bridged the distance between them fastest, for the girl attached herself to Ruth with the fierce, uncomplicated love that only a lonely child can give, following her from chore to chore, asking 100 questions a day, and falling asleep some nights with her small head resting against Ruth's arm while Ruth read to her from the Bible with the broken spine, the very same one that had traveled with her from Kansas. It was on one particular evening, some 6 weeks into her new life, that Ruth truly understood how far she had come from that ragged, frightened woman stepping off the stagecoach. A storm had rolled down from the mountains that afternoon, black clouds swallowing the sun whole, and Thomas had been out on the range rounding up cattle that had scattered before the coming rain. Sarah, watching the lightning crack across the darkening sky, grew frightened that her father would not return, for she remembered, though she rarely spoke of it, that her mother had died of a fever that came on suddenly in weather much like this, and children carry such memories close even when they cannot name the fear correctly. Ruth held the girl through the worst of the storm, singing hymns low and steady even as the windows rattled and the rain hammered the roof, and when Thomas finally came through the door soaked to the bone but whole and safe, Sarah ran to him first, but then turned back and pulled Ruth into the embrace as well, and for the first time, the three of them stood together in that small kitchen as something that felt, undeniably, like a family. But the frontier rarely allows peace to settle for long, and trouble arrived in Dry Creek not many weeks later in the form of a man named Silas Renner, a cattle buyer who had once done business with Thomas and who, it turned out, had never forgiven him for a dispute over stolen stock some years before, a dispute in which Thomas had been proven right and Renner had been run out of 2 counties for rustling. Renner returned to Dry Creek with money in his pocket and vengeance on his mind, and being a man who understood that reputation was worth more than gunpowder on the frontier, he began spreading a poisonous rumor through town that Ruth Calloway was no honest mail-order bride at all, but a woman running from a criminal past back east. A woman who had perhaps even been party to the very stagecoach robbery that had left her in rags in the first place. It was a lie built from nothing but cruelty, but lies on the frontier could travel faster than any horse, and soon the townsfolk who had once merely whispered about her ragged dress began whispering something far more dangerous. Thomas heard the rumors first from the blacksmith, and his first instinct was a fury he had not felt since Martha's death, a fury that nearly sent him storming into the saloon where Renner liked to hold court among men who owed him drinking money. But it was Ruth who stopped him, placing her hand on his arm and telling him, with a steadiness that surprised them both, that she would not have him fight her battles with his fists, when the truth itself was a far sharper weapon. And so, on a Sunday morning when the church at Dry Creek was fullest, Ruth Calloway stood before the congregation, her chin lifted, her voice unwavering, and told them plainly who she was, a woman who had lost her family to fever and her livelihood to fire, who had answered an honest letter with an honest heart, and who had done nothing in her life to be ashamed of except perhaps the poverty that circumstance, not sin, had forced upon her. She spoke of the stagecoach robbery not as a crime she had committed but as one she had survived, and she asked the town plainly whether a woman who had spent 6 weeks caring for a grieving child and a widowed rancher, asking nothing in return but the chance to belong somewhere, deserved to be judged by rags and rumor rather than by her actions. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was Sarah who broke it, small and fierce, standing up in the pew and declaring to the whole congregation that Ruth was the best mamma any girl could ask for, and that whoever said otherwise was simply wrong. The child's voice, so full of unguarded love, did more to sway the room than any argument Ruth could have made, and one by one, the doubtful faces softened, until even the blacksmith's wife, shamed by her own earlier cruelty, came forward afterward to apologize. Silas Renner, seeing his scheme collapse and knowing that Thomas Grady was not a man to let slander stand unanswered forever, left Dry Creek within the week and was never seen in that territory again, his lie exposed as the bitter revenge it always was. It was after this trial, standing together on the church steps beneath a sky washed clean by the previous night's rain, that Thomas Grady finally spoke the words he had been carrying quietly in his chest since the night of the storm. He told Ruth, plainly and without the polish of a practiced romantic, that he had married her out of necessity but had come, in these short weeks, to love her out of choice, and that he could not imagine the ranch, the house, or his daughter's life without her steady presence in it. Ruth, who had spent so many years believing herself unlovable, unwanted, a burden to be tolerated rather than a woman to be cherished, wept then, openly, in the sunlight, and told him that she had never in her life been given a home until he and his daughter had offered her one, rags and all. The years that followed were not without their hardships, for frontier life spared no one its trials. There were droughts that threatened the herd, a hard winter that took 2 of their cattle and nearly took Sarah with a fever that frightened them all half to death, and the slow, grinding work of building a life from land that gave nothing freely. But through it all, Ruth Calloway Grady proved herself not merely a wife but the very heart of that household, the woman who kept faith burning in the hearth even when the wind outside howled its coldest, who taught Sarah her letters and her prayers, and who, 3 years after that first ragged arrival, held a second child, a son they named after no one but simply called Joseph, in her arms beneath the same Montana sky that had once watched her step off a stagecoach with nothing but a broken spine Bible and a desperate hope. Before this story reaches its close, I want to ask you, wherever you are watching from tonight, whether in a quiet house in the American plains or across an ocean far from these old western trails, to leave a comment telling us where in the world you are, and what lesson this story stirred in your heart. Perhaps it reminded you that kindness costs nothing but means everything, or that the family we build with love can matter more than the family we are given by blood, or that a person's worth is never measured by the state of their clothes but by the content of their character. Whatever it was, we would be honored to hear it from you. Sarah Grady grew up beneath Ruth's steady love, and in later years, when she herself was a grown woman with children of her own, she would tell them the story of the day a ragged stranger stepped off a stagecoach into Dry Creek, and how she, a lonely 6-year-old girl who had lost her mother, had looked past the torn dress and dusty boots and seen instead a woman worth loving. and had whispered 3 words that changed the course of all their lives forever. She would tell them that faith sometimes arrives not in miracles of light and thunder but in quiet moments, in a small hand reaching for a stranger's, in a prayer answered not with wealth or ease but with a person willing to stay. And she would tell them, always, that home is not a place built of timber and stone, but a promise kept by people who choose, again and again, to love one another through every storm the frontier sends their way. If this story touched your heart tonight, if you believe as Ruth and Thomas and little Sarah believed, in second chances, in the quiet courage of starting over, in love that looks past rags to see the soul beneath, then I ask you one final time to like, comment, share, and subscribe, so that stories like this one may continue to find their way to hearts that need them. May you carry a little of Dry Creek's hard-won hope with you, wherever your own road leads.